the pleasure to participate in the webinar. And I want to welcome everybody to the webinar Wednesdays. And today's topic is helping students fund their studies globally. And I'm going to be passing on to our lovely panelists, and they will be introducing themselves soon. Before we do that, we're going to be launching a couple of polls here. So if we would love for you to answer some of the polls. I'll close the poll shortly, but you should be able to see them up in now. And we'll read the results soon here. And one last thing before we move on that I would like to request is that you can utilize the question and answer function to ask questions throughout the webinar. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end. We'll facilitate that, but if you can please use the Q&A function for that. And you have access to chat function too, and there will be a time where we will request you to use that as well. Thank you and welcome, and enjoy the webinar.
Hi everyone, my name is Anne Payne. I'm the academic and college counselor at the International School of Latvia. You would be forgiven for not knowing where Latvia is if you have to reach for your atlas. So we're a tiny country of around 2 million people in Northeast Europe.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Bella Gligurova. I'm the secondary school principal and the director of guidance and counseling at Nova International Schools. It's located in the quaint little town of Skopje in North Macedonia, right in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Masra Shaisayas. I am Ethiopian originally, but I'm currently working at the African Leadership Academy in usually sunny, but today cloudy Johannesburg, South Africa. So we're really glad to have you here. Thank you for being here. We would like to start off with some of our objectives for today's webinar. The first one being we would like to address the glossary of terms pertaining to higher education and funding. So we can provide some explanations to some of the terms that are used in pursuing funding in higher education.
We'd also like to consider the role that a student's passport status, as well as the leaving certificate or final diploma that they earn from their secondary school might play, and how that might influence their pursuit of different forms of financial aid.
And finally, we want to acknowledge the role that an institutional financial aid model may play in the pursuit of making sure that students have access to higher education aid, and bearing in mind what the institution's own application model is in regards to pursuing institutional aid.
Take the next slide, Fred.
Sounds great. I've just we have the poll results, so if you'd like to announce that there's also a second poll that I'm going to be launching. So as we discuss the first poll, then you'd have one more poll that is showing up right now, and we'll close both shortly here. In ways, it's going as fast as I've ever seen a poll being answered in my life. So we'll have the results. It's just a second here. When I launched the second one, sorry, the first results went away. So that's on me. I apologize for that. So I will shortly end the poll as well. Perfect.
Okay, I think I can announce the poll results now. So we have about 16% joining us from Sub-Saharan Africa, about 10% from Canada and the US, 1% from Caribbean, Central America and Mexico, 14% from East Asia, 28% from Europe, 4% from the Middle East and North Africa, 8% from South America, 8% from South and Central Asia, and 11% from Southeast Asia and Oceania. So a pretty diverse group, and we're all lucky to have you on this webinar. And the second poll is about your member category. Rightfully so, about 59% represent a secondary school, about 16% represent a university or college, 17 are individual counselors, and 8% represent an organization, a community-based organization. So thank you. So we are going to try and be as interactive as possible. So what you now see on this slide is an opportunity for us to have a conversation through a kind of a chat waterfall, if you're familiar with that. We're going to go through the glossary of terms, and feel free to utilize the chat box. Each time we move through a term, please make sure that you write in the chat box how you see this particular term being defined, how you understand it, and of course, how you apply it. So the first term, this very open-ended term of financial aid. If we could have the participants on the webinar use the chat box to write to us and say, you know, this is how I understand it, this is how I use it, this is how I apply it, financial aid. Okay, so scholarships, grants, loans, work study, any combination thereof, any financial help for students, could be need, could be merit. A general term for all options. So yes, financial aid is an all-encompassing term, very much funding provided to students who need access in order to fund their education. It could come in the format of scholarships, tuition awards, grants, loans. Now, certain educational systems, higher education models, make a distinction between need-based and merit-based financial aid. So if we could use the chat box to make a distinction, how you see need-based versus merit-based financial aid. So need-based financial aid. Okay, so looking for need-based is based on family income. Merit-based is based on things students have done, their accomplishments. Need-based, family income. Need-based, families need, right? So the understanding that income plays a role, but also need plays a role. And sometimes a family's income status does not always address a student's need. And that's why we talk about gapping oftentimes. Merit-based, right? Academic achievement. Merit-based, awarded due to students' talents. So it doesn't have to be purely academic, right? It could be athletic or talent-based in some regard. Very good. So a tuition scholarship, how would you see this particular term? Partial or full tuition waiver, very much so. So not money that a student would need to later on return to that institution or to the giver of that waiver. So yes, it just goes towards tuition. It does not include housing or other costs. Right. Can be both need or merit based. That's interesting, yes. It could only be applied to the tuition fee, and very much it could be partial or full, and that could depend on a number of circumstances. And very rightfully so, sometimes it is for a limited period of time, a semester, a year, or maybe it's renewable for 3 or 4 years, depending on the length of the course of study. Okay, thank you so much. So the term loan, right? Something that adulthood has taught us all too well, but it's also quite an open-ended term when it comes to financial aid. What are some of the associations and understandings that you have in terms of the term loan and financial aid? You have to pay it back. Okay, the term of paying it back is also something that an institution can in fact help further delineate. But yes, it could be governmentally funded, it could be private, therefore it could be subsidized or unsubsidized. In some cases, it's a financial aid package that needs to be paid back, sometimes with interest. And we have loans being for the student or loans being for the parent, right? A student taking out the loan if they're able to do so, or a family taking out a loan and helping a student. True. Then governmental subsidies. This is again a specific term. It is used oftentimes in conversation with financial aid. Any thoughts on what this term governmental subsidies could in fact encompass? Lower interest loans, okay? Yes, loans available to European Union students in the case of the government being a European Union government. Okay, governmental money with some stipulations. The example provided is Singapore and the government of Singapore's scheme in terms of attracting international students for longer term periods, not just their studies. And then the last term that is also being used quite frequently is the term stipends. And again, it's a very open-ended term. It can mean several things depending on where the institution is located. So any associations with stipends? Money that a student would receive in order to pay for their housing, money paid to the student for their own use, working for a minimum wage, okay. And in some cases, in the context of European conversation, a stipend can also refer to a form of a scholarship that a student would receive for, again, their housing or life benefits. Well, thank you. This was most useful. So it's good that we are now equalizing the playing field, and therefore how we pursue in terms of the rest of the webinar could be very purposeful for you in regards to these terms and how we apply them. So maybe we can have the next slide.
Okay, thank you so much, Bella. That was great. So again, my name is Mesh, and I work at the African Leadership Academy. And I want to state that whatever is going to happen, the things that I'm going to talk about, is solely based on my experience. I am by no means no expert. This is just from working with high achieving, low income students and looking at their experience, and the focus being trying to find funding. So I thought it would be quite informative to talk about some universities and institutions that do provide funding opportunities for students everywhere, but specifically for African students within Africa, and also to explore some universities and institutions in Asia as well. Next slide, please. So just general information about the two vastly huge and quite different continents. In the continent of Africa, there are 1,225 universities. Most universities are government owned, with a few private institutions as well. And Some are free for their institutions, which means that these would be government subsidized fundings for students, and students would have to pay them back after a year or 2 years of graduation. There are 601 private institutions. Some private institutions will provide merit-based admissions and scholarship as well. There is a huge shift of MasterCard scholarship programs to institutions, universities, and colleges to the African continent. So that's something that we're going to talk about as well. When we go to Asia, we have about 6,000 officially recognized higher education institutions. There's both private and public institutions. Asia's mostly merit-based admission and scholarship as well. There are some government-funded scholarships depending on the country in which, the Asian country, and the diplomatic relationship that they may have with another country, maybe in Africa or anywhere else. Next slide, please. All right, so I thought it would be interesting if I just gave you a little snippet of examples of countries from the two continents. So when we look at Ghana, the Ministry of Higher Education in Ghana requires 3 A-levels for students to enroll into university. So if you're an international student applying to Ghana, you would need to at least have 3 A-levels or have a secondary leaving certificate from your origin of country. So for example, if you're a student graduating from Rwanda, you would have to have that equivalency transferred into Ghana. There is some MasterCard scholarship available in some institutions. For example, Ashesi and Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. These institutions have MasterCard scholarships available. And in terms of Ashesi, they also actually have institutional funding that is available. That's not part of the MasterCard scholarship, but they have their own institutional funding that is available for international students. I would like to highlight that it is merit-based, right? So they're going to be looking at the grades, they're going to be looking at scores, and that's how they're going to be analyzing for you, for the student either to be admitted or to actually gain scholarship. Moving all the way down south, we have South Africa. Most universities in South Africa are private institutions. South Africa is quite tricky because they are very strict on the school equivalency that they require for the application, both for their admission and for the scholarship as well. So if you have a student that's interested in applying to South Africa, you'd have to make sure that from the origin of country, it can be equivalated to the South African standard of higher education. So it's dependent on where the student is originally from. For South African citizens, they have NSFAS, which is a government loan, which is also the same as government subsidy, and you have to apply for it. MasterCard Foundation also just announced that they're starting their program in University of Cape Town and University of Pretoria. University of Cape Town is actually quite perfect for students who are interested in medicine, engineering, direct programs, which is, if you know how the UK works, it's almost the same in South Africa as well, direct programs that students can apply to. They also have institutional financial aid, which is great for students who need the funding, and also allow students to work part-time so they can fund their schooling as well. Next slide, please. And I just thought I would just drop, because I can't go through the whole continent. ALU in African Leadership University in Rwanda offers an amazing conservation program that is aimed at ensuring that wildlife conservation is actually taught as a program on the African continent. In order for a student to be admitted into ALU Rwanda, they would need to have a secondary school leaving equivalency requirement that is going to be approved by the Rwandese government. And then a branch of ALU is also called ALC, which is African Leadership College in Mauritius. They have engineering programs and computer science programs. It is almost the same requirement as also a UK school. They need 3 A-levels. Both institutions do have full scholarships available via MasterCard. And if you have students that are interested in these institutions, I think MasterCard and also Mauritius is relatively cheaper. So I think it's about $15,000 for a year. And with people who have with students who have EFC of maybe 10,000 or 5,000, the gap can be met where they can find need-based funding as well. Another example that I'll just quickly mention is the Coupler and Southern Hampshire University in Rwanda, which is an online class which is led by facilitators. And the students will be able to get a US degree after they finish this program. This here is what they have, a tuition deferment. So they will accept the students, all of them, and then they will defer. So after they graduate, it's almost like a government grant as well. They will be able to make the payment afterwards. Another upcoming institution is the International University of Grand Bassam in Cote d'Ivoire. Some funding is available, which is up to $10,000 for the program. It is a mixture of French and English program. So if you have students that are interested in applying to study in Cote d'Ivoire, that's also an option. And there are some satellite colleges in Mauritius. For example, you can look at Middlesex. So these universities will have, they will provide the degree from the original country as well. It is relatively cheaper to attend these universities than the original universities, right? So those are options as well. Some universities like University of Botswana are free for citizens, and if there are students who are interested in applying, they can also get some scholarships as well. And the next slide, please. Right, now we are in Asia. So looking at Japan, we have some institutions, some international institutions. For example, we have Asian Pacific University, International Christian University, and Doshisha University, who are eager to recruit international students from the globe. So depending on the diplomatic relations your country has, your student's country has with Japan, they'll be able to apply for the Mexit Scholarship, which covers, which provides tuition waiver, travel cost, cost of living. In other instances where, for example, Asian Pacific University will provide tuition waivers, but will need to have the student cover cover living expenses and travel costs as well. So they will provide you that opportunity for the student to actually do a part-time job so they can cover their living expenses. So it may differ from 30% to 100% tuition waiver is available to some institutions in Japan. Moving to South Korea, we also have similar things where we have tuition waivers that are available, same as 30 to 100%. And also another thing to look at is the Global Korea Scholarship Program, which is if your student is interested, for example, in applying to Yonsei, which is Underwood International College, you can have the student be nominated by the South Korean embassy in their country. That means the South Korean embassy will collect the documents, submit their application, and then if it gets approved, then the student is going to have financial means to attend the institution that they've applied to. I would also like to highlight that South Korea has merit-based scholarships that are available. They also go to the extra mile and provide employment exhibitions that are held every year to assist foreign students in employment, which are part-time and full-time. For both of these countries, obviously, I would say make sure that the students are actually interested in going to these countries and that they would like to learn the language, because that's going to be really important. And next slide, please. Right, this is the last one. So that is Hong Kong. Hong Kong, similarly to South Korea, has lots of merit-based scholarships. As you can see, He for She Impact Champion Scholarship is for students that are advocates or change makers for women empowerment movements, or they've raised awareness, things like that. Hong Ping for Nigerian students, very specific, but if you do have Nigerian students who are interested in applying to Hong Kong University, this is an option for them. And as you can see, Hong Kong for Future Leaders, all of these things, they will be competitive because they're merit-based scholarships, but they will provide students with access to some sort of funding for them to attend Hong Kong University. If you want the best results, please apply early. They will need A-levels and SAT score required for the scholarship. And this thing might be a bit tricky because they do need large deposits for enrollment, which is also the same in Japan, where they might be like $2,000 for deposits enrollment. So then if you're having this conversation with a student, you have to make sure at least their EFC is up to $2,000. And then the rest, we could say, if they can get funding, if they can get the tuition waivers, then they'll be able to enroll. And I think that is it for me. As you can see, there's examples, HKBU, Hong Kong University, Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So that's all my experience. Next slide, please.
Okay, so welcome to the European continent. For those of us who reside on the European continent, particularly for those of us who reside in the non-EU part of the European continent, this kind of conversation of a united Europe is a conversation we are very careful when engaging in, particularly from the perspective of access and selectivity. And definitely financial aid. So when you think of Europe in terms of access to higher education, as well as access to financial aid, always think of Europe as being made of several different blocks. The UK and the UK post-Brexit is one part of the equation. The EU zone countries is another part of the equation. The non-EU countries is a third part of the equation. And then we also have the EEA countries. Some are members of the EU zone and some are not. And the reason why we're highlighting this is because access to education in terms of access to equivalency and being able to study in a European country is based on a lot of conversations that are happening in terms of where the student's passport comes from, as well as the kind of secondary school leaving certificate they have, even before taking into account finances and their ability to pay and how much would they be paying for and whether they would get any institutional support for that or not. So really, know the geography, the political geography of your students when engaging in conversations about access and selectivity. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So how is it useful, maybe not best, but useful to define access for students that are interested in studying on the European continent? Nationality or your citizenship by passport. There's a big difference, for example, if your student is an EU passport holder versus being a non-EU passport holder from the continent or even non-EU international, because they're very specific cost brackets. Certain countries, for example, countries like the Netherlands or countries like Italy, have different paying scales when it comes to students' nationality. Now, I should highlight this is the student's nationality / passport, not their parents. In Europe, for the most part, in continental Europe and the EU zone, that is what matters when talking about access. Now, pathways, meaning what the student's secondary school leaving certificate is. Does the student have the full IB diploma or are they an IB certificate student? Do they have the careers program? Are they an AP student? Do they have 4 APs? Have they taken the SAT? Will they get a US high school diploma accompanying their IB certificates? Will they get any diploma? Is a student simply matriculating through a national system or any other system thereof, the French bac, the European bac, the A levels? So for the most part, non-EU as well as EU countries really look at the secondary school certificate. And for the most part, they practice a form of equivalency. In other words, they are going to make sure that the foreign national student that is coming to their country to study has a secondary school leaving certificate that is the equivalent to their national pathway. So to ensure that students who are matriculating through the national pathway of the European country are not being disprivileged and vice versa. Now, this again has an added component to it, and that means It's not just about practicing equivalency without nostrification, without the added component of a Ministry of Education verifying that the secondary school leaving certificate is legitimate, but what the student is going to study is important as well. And this becomes even further more important when we talk about defining selectivity, because there's certain quotas. So there are quotas in terms of the number of students, their caps, let's call them, that a particular university and a particular degree program could potentially take from the non-EU versus the foreign national as well. As well as the EU national. So sometimes if you have a dual passport holder, which is quite a lot of the students that my school works with, having an EU passport may really work for access, but may not work for selectivity. And being able to know that and being able to understand the fine line in terms of the degree that the student is going to pursue would require for you to do a little bit of further investigating. The information is out there and we will provide you with some further information. So there is, in terms of selectivity as a final point, a selection at the gate. So although for the most part, direct university entry to a European university, particularly on the continent, is based on equivalency. For programs that are selective and have a form of quotas, there will be further either testing or further evaluation at the gate before a student is given an offer. Next slide, please.
All right, so I just, before I dive into talking about my European experiences, I just want to go back to what Mash said at the start. I am no expert. I can only talk about my own lived experiences here. And one of the things I've really appreciated in acclimating to the European higher education system is the fact that there is an incredibly supportive network of college counselors who have expertise in their region and area. So the knowledge that I have today that I'm sharing is cobbled together from very appreciative of colleagues who've supported me along this journey, and I'm happy to pay that forward in any way that I can. For context, Latvia is in the European Union, and about 2/3 of my students hold an EU passport. We do also have a substantive portion of our population who are Russian passport holders as well, many of whom who are in the process of working toward EU citizenship. So sometimes we have that fine line to navigate here at ISL. We award both the IB diploma and the US high school diploma. So we have students that go both pathways and experience with placing them into higher ed. And especially given our current circumstances, most of my students are looking to stay in Europe at this point. I have 28 seniors and only 3 of them are looking to leave the continent, which is a pretty stark change from years past. So as I dive in, there are really 2 questions that Bella brought to light that I want to explore as we look at our options in continental Europe. And the first of those is the affordability question based on passport, right? So a lot of different factors come into play with that affordability question: your tuition piece, your cost of attendance piece, what resources are available for you to utilize in terms of employment, scholarship, etc. So both of those things are hopefully things that I'll explore or at least have resources linked to as we go on in the next slides. So go ahead and advance. All right, so we've got a nice snowy scene in Latvia there for you guys to enjoy. Before I dive into talking about country-specific components, I do want to talk about the fit piece when you're thinking about students who might be potentially exploring options in Europe. And that is that culturally there are very different regions of Europe and different expectations that you can have based on where you'll be. I want to be very frank, for example, that Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are very white countries, and it might be a bit of a shocking time for a student of color to come to this region and realize just how very white this place is. So just in speaking to your students, making sure that they're aware and understand. And I see in the chat, Candace from Denmark has also shared, yes, Denmark is very white. Northern Europe is very white. And that is part of the conversation. So want to be aware that in different parts of Eastern Europe, there are varying levels of acceptance for LGBTQ students. So understanding and researching the climate of the region before you talk with students about coming to this part of the world. So the 7 countries that I've highlighted here, we've got kind of a range of options represented, and I've selected them all for different reasons. So Denmark, let's start there. No tuition fees at many universities for EU passport holders. But that's where that cost of living conversation really does come into play. And I know Candace is here in Denmark and can probably attest to the fact that that can be a deterring factor for students who are considering, yeah, definitely expensive, who are considering higher education there. So each of these pages will link to the respective study in site, some of them directly to some of the scholarship opportunities that are available. Because scholarships tend to be a bit piecemeal in these countries, it's one that you may want to dive in and do some exploring on your own, or if you have students who are keen for these options, looking through the sites together and seeing what might be potential options for them to explore. Looking at Estonia, so a number of high-tech programs there. If you have students who are interested in anything in cybersecurity, in computer science and business, a number of strong programs, as well as a medical school in Estonia. That cybersecurity program is tuition-free at Tallinn University of Technology for EU passport holders. So that's been quite a popular one. Estonia also has a lower cost of living. It's the highest cost of living in the Baltics, but still very much affordable for students. I saw a question in the chat about whether the slides are going to be available. Oh yeah, I just see the response. The slides will be available, so you'll be able to use and utilize these links. Finland, likewise, tuition-free for public universities for many EU passport holders. Some programs do have a supplemental fee attached to them. And be aware, again, cost of living in Helsinki can get high. And so that's something for students to think about. Although there are some fantastic art and design programs, if you have not explored that avenue, I think I've linked it in the future or in the upcoming slides here, but Aalto University has a nice full tuition scholarship program that you can look through with students. So Latvia, there are a number of English taught universities here and the cost of living is quite low. You're typically looking at around 250 to 600 euros per month, all inclusive. So very easy for students to find cheap apartments in the center, quite easy to get around. And in Latvia, we have a number of programs that are scholarship programs that are linked to passport status. So if there are specific diplomatic relations between Latvia and your country, your students may qualify for the Latvian Student Scholarship bilateral agreement. There are 25 countries that are detailed in that agreement, and the full list is linked on the Latvia link. And if you start exploring these links and are having trouble finding something, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to clarify any questions you might have. Lithuania offers some fantastic tuition reduction programs for students. So in particular, we're seeing some schools that have a 50% tuition reduction program for students from Central Asia or who hold a passport from Central Asia, anywhere in the Caucasus, as well as South and Central America, getting that tuition down to around 1,000 euros per year, plus again, low cost of living right in that range of 250 to 600 euros per month. So very, very affordable, certainly. And then Norway and Sweden, similarly, low to no tuition fees, but high cost of living. So similar to Denmark and Finland. And yeah, I see Uni's point in the chat that undergraduate courses in English may be limited in some of these countries. So all of the sites that are linked on here also have a search function where you can explore programs that are available in those countries. So if your student is looking for something very particular, they may find it. For example, you'll see in Norway that there is an Arctic tourism program that students can major in, very apropos. And there are some very specific kind of design programs. Business is commonly taught in English, but for some of the more specialized degrees, you may have trouble, for example, finding engineering taught in English. But again, these websites should all have search features where you can parse those out and look through options with your students. Yep, and I see Candice mentioning Copenhagen Business School, absolutely. Great, so if you can give us the next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about our traditional full ride scholarship, typically your full ride scholarship will be more commonly found at a private institution. So you can see Jakob's linked on there. In particular, they do a very special program where they offer one full scholarship. I believe it's per continent, and students apply for that and are selected. They do also have merit aid as well as loans available. Some of these schools, it's a bit harder to find information on, but they do for strong students have a tuition remission program where they'll offer one free year. So I've linked Tallinn, the University of Tartu, Aalto, and Kaunas University of Technology, as well as LCC International, who all offer that like 1 year tuition remission. So if students can have 1 year paid during the program, still benefit them. I also want to mention LCC International University does offer sports scholarships. They are one of the few European universities that I'm aware of, at least, that offers these. I believe right now they're offering a 50% basketball scholarship, and that is located in Klaipėda, Lithuania. Sorry, Andrea, I just saw your question. So the websites are linked. The websites for each specific country are linked on the slide. So when we share it out, those are all hyperlinked and you'll be able to visit those web pages. So I think we've addressed, yeah, for sure. We've addressed many of the different factors that schools would look at when making these decisions. Occasionally at your private schools, you would see a more holistic selection process, students submitting CVs, recommendation letters, resumes, though many of the schools, particularly here in the Baltics, are looking for a pure ranking based on academic results. And that is actually irrespective of the diploma pathway. So some of my US high school diploma students have had a bit of an easier go at getting more funding than our IB diploma students. So that's something to be aware of if you're looking for an option for that student who may not be on that IB pathway. I also want to mention just quickly, in case any of you do have students who have family ties to this region, Lithuania offers scholarships for students that have a connection, a grandparent, I think even a great-grandparent potentially, if they can make that trace. That's something I've never had a student go through that program. I've heard it mentioned. If anyone wants to explore that further, again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to explore that. If you can give us the next slide, please. All right.
Okay. We also want to be mindful of the fact that potentially for many of your students, they would be looking at substantial financial aid. And when taking into account the European continent, in all of the scenarios, the parents would still need to be able to foot the bill, so to speak. Now that bill could be related to maybe 1/3 of what a US higher education would cost. But again, in most cases, the parents would be the ones that would need to take out a loan or work through their savings to be able to provide that kind of access for their child, because that is how European higher education functions for the most part. And we wanted to make sure that those of you who represent high achieving low income students that our lovely colleagues in Africa call Halley Kids also have something to take away from today's webinar. So a crash course into US higher education in terms of the financial aid landscape. We want you to be mindful of these three particular stipulations. That when you're researching for your high achieving low income students, what would be a good fit? Bear in mind that language matters. Language in terms of finances matters, and every institution is very clear about that on their website. So you may have institutions who, for international applicants to the US, would provide this category of need-based financial aid, but then they would make the commitment to meet fully demonstrated need. So in that case, potentially, your applicant, your high achieving low income student could in fact be able to have their education covered. There are institutions, and for the larger part, most higher ed institutions in the US that grant financial aid to international students fit into the second category, that they're need sensitive or need aware, but also make the commitment to meet fully demonstrated need. And that's why the CSS profile, which we're going to talk about next, is highly relevant. And that is why you, as someone guiding them through that process, would need to be very clear in terms of whether your student and their family are clear for the different categories on that profile. And then we do have the last category, which would not be a good fit for someone who is a high achieving low income student and even would fit into the category of the fully needy student. Because you could have a very good institution in the US that is need blind, but very clearly says that they do not meet fully demonstrated need. And therefore, your student may be admitted, may be given financial aid, but they would still need to gap. And oftentimes that gap would include substantial cost, let alone the hidden costs, right? Which are not necessarily always on a financial aid letter. So it's very, very important that you take that into account. I see in the chat box, we have Sarah who talks about 5 US schools that are in the first category for internationals, and then schools that are need aware and meet fully demonstrated need. So thank you for that information, Sarah. Okay, so the next component, and hopefully we can make this further interactive, is just to give you an infographic in terms of conceptualizing the process for how a financial aid application / letter would look like, what the categories need to bear in mind. So cost of attendance, right? Now cost of attendance at a US higher education institution is tuition and fees, it's room and board, and then there is this lovely further category of books, supplies, transportation expenses, health insurance, and miscellaneous, right? Miscellaneous such as, you know, you need a visa to go to the US, right? You need to pay the SEVIS fee. So it's very important that when having a discussion with a potential applicant, that all of these things are taken into account. Now, when you scroll down and look at cost of attendance in terms of the bulk that it is, right, in all of these categories, it's very important to see what the expected family contribution could in fact be. And this is where families need to be very, very clear in the information that they give and potentially in the supporting documents that they provide with that information. And then of course, right, some basic arithmetic, cost of attendance minus the expected family contribution, we come potentially to the financial aid package, which could be need aware, need blind, grant, scholarship, work study, because US institutions use different categories depending on what their institutional praxis is. So bear this in mind as Mash introduces you to what we hope the activity could be next. So if we could go to the next slide.
Thank you so much, Bella. Thank you for creating the framework of what our next activity is. So here we have a financial aid that is received from a real student. And I thought it would be more interactive if we had some of the participants identify what is going to be the cost of attendance and what is going to be the EFC expected family contribution and what the miscellaneous cost is going to be, so that when we have conversations with parents, the more frank and accurate conversation we can have with them, the better we can have an understanding of how much they are willing to pay and how much they can pay, not willing, but actually are able to pay. So if you can, Fred, where's Fred? If
Yes,
you can, hi Fred.
hello.
Hi. Can you see if there's like hands up, or do we just want to do it in the chat box?
I don't see any hands up yet, but if you see the hands up opportunities, you guys will have that at the bottom of your screen. So if you would like to speak up, and just raise your hand, and what I can do is I'll add you to the, I'll be able to enable your microphone. So I see one right now. Go ahead and Sarah will be invited to speak. Sarah, you should be able to have your mic open now.
Okay, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Essentially, you add up all of the costs. I'm not going to do the maths because it's very early here for me, but you add up all of the total costs and you subtract, which includes everything on this page is listed as a cost: full tuition, books and supplies. I would also add travel, which I don't see here. Expenses. Also, I want to point out, particularly for international students, the health costs are high. 2,500 is, I would say, an average. I've seen health plans, Brown's health plans, more like 3,500, very few or less than that. And then you subtract from that any scholarships. Now, international students don't qualify for loans in the US, so you have to look very closely and just see how, hopefully most of it is grant aid, and you would subtract it. I mean, it is very, very expensive. This year, I had a student admitted to Brown, and as part of getting the F1 visa, you have to fill out the certificate of finances, and Brown asks you to project forward 4 years, giving an increase of 2 to 3% in tuition each year. And by the 4th year, the annual expenses, full cost of attendance, was almost $100,000. And the father actually called me and said, "Is that really correct?" And I said, "Yes." So that's it. It's a very big number.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that. But yeah, I think that's pretty much straightforward. Just calculating the total costs and minus the financial aid. So you can see here, I think the student got scholarship and grant. And there are some institutions that do loan. So for example, there's like a 3,000 loan from the institution. So it has nothing to do with the government or with the state that the school is in. If the school is willing to do that, then the student and the parents have to agree on the percentage, the interest that's going to be on the loan. Some institutions are not going to have an interest on it. They'll just loan you the money and then you just have to pay it back later on. So we just wanted to do this to create more context. This is like real life, right? So we're going into the application season. So these are the things that we're going to have to consider as we're counseling our students and as we're having these really honest and frank conversations with our parents. And we also wanted to point out, you can also use the net calculator so that you can clearly say, hey, parent A, this is how much is going to be expected for you to pay, to contribute towards your child's higher education fees. Next slide, please. Thank you for that, Sarah.
And could I just add, please have this conversation early. I mean, I've had parents come in and and then secretly call me later and say, we really can't afford this, but we don't want to tell our child that. Now, it's not our responsibility to get into that dynamic, but please tell them and also encourage them about the wonderful options and more affordable options in Europe. I mean, one thing I say, I work a lot with students in Greece. One thing I say is, look, you know, they could go, I mean, England is now very expensive, but they could go to Holland, and then they could get a master's in the US, or a master's, which would be perhaps a better.
One thing to also speak to that point that you've just made, Sarah, there's also the Erasmus scheme in Europe, where if, you know, students do end up in one country, they then have the opportunity to have a study experience in another country. So if you have a student who's, you know, quite keen on spending some time in the Netherlands, but financially can't swing it, but Lithuania is an option, for example, then they've also got the Erasmus scheme to help them access that. All right, so this is, of course, by no means an exhaustive list. I know that there are certainly a lot more of them out there. This is just a subset of some full ride scholarships and some flagship merit-based scholarships that we are aware of and have had experiences with ourselves. Again, hyperlinked so that you are able to access this. And yeah, Candace brings up a really great point. There is a lovely sheet about financial aid for international students that is updated. I think that's Jenny Kent, Big J Consulting, that has that. And I think the link might be in the chat. Sorry, things are going too quick for me to follow. And then next slide. I would be remiss if I didn't throw a reference to Canada in here as well. There are select substantive scholarships that are available. I'm sure probably many of you are familiar with the International Leader of Tomorrow Scholarship at the University of British Columbia, as well as the University of Toronto Pearson Scholarship, both highly competitive. I found it helpful when I have students who have unrealistic expectations to read through the profiles of the Pearson scholars and the ILOT students. If any of you on the chat have had students who've recently won the ILOT or the Pearson Scholarship, my students have been reading about your students and are just wowed by them. So that's a nice tool for also getting them to realize that the pool for these kinds of scholarships is immensely, immensely competitive. Often, if I have a student who's interested in Canada, we are having the chat more about the low fees and scholarship combination. So in particular, I have a lot of students who look at Memorial University of Newfoundland with their 2 campuses, low tuition and potential opportunities for scholarship, as well as the University of Alberta that offers an IB scholarship. I didn't link it on here, but the University of Prince Edward Island as well. And then one of the other factors that we can often include when we're having that conversation about whether Canada is financially viable is thinking about funds that they would bring in through doing a co-op during their time there. And obviously hard to get an exact figure on how much a student can expect to make, but if they are in a slightly more comfortable region financially, then they can potentially swing it that way. Great. Oh yeah, and I just see a note from Andrea. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing this. So Central European University in Vienna, which has recently moved some of its programs to Vienna, and I have some very excited students who can't wait to apply this year. They are offering 2 full ride scholarships to their BA in quantitative social sciences next year. So if you have anyone who is interested, Andrea, can they contact you directly? Okay, I'll make sure to repost that note so that everyone can see that. Great. All right.
We also had a comment in the chat box, and if we could go back, maybe this is a Fred a question to the flagship merit-based scholarships slide. Yeah.
Sure. Of course.
And while we are in the question and answer, starting this now, I believe a theme has become available here in terms of medicine in the EU for EU citizens and non-EU citizens. There's a question in the Q&A box about that, and from a student in Uganda. And then there was another one at the chat function. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about that too, that'd be great.
So I can speak to the Baltics, at least in terms of low-cost medicine here. Flat out tuition, we're talking around 12,000 to 15,000 euros. So it is not as affordable, unfortunately, as other programs in the region, but still perhaps more affordable than other medicine options out there. The most affordable that I'm aware of, and I'm hesitant to even say this given the unrest that's going on right now, is Gomel State University in Belarus. But I think that's one you would have to certainly take with a grain of salt, just given the current political circumstances in Belarus.
And if I may add, because medicine is culturally contextual, right? Speaking the local language is key. So although there are affordable options, particularly in Hungary for medicine, and particularly through the Stipendium Hungaricum, which is a Hungarian governmental scholarship scheme that basically provides for full funding, and it goes between Hungary and different countries globally, and it sets the tone in terms of undergraduate, postgraduate, graduate, these particular types of degrees and so forth. Although there is still selection at the gate, a student would need to pass the entrance exam. The costs are not too high. However, at a certain point within the student's journey for the 5 or 6 year degree, in order for them to really work with patients, they would need to be able to speak the local language. And Hungarian is not the easiest language to learn, so they would need to be making this very specific commitment. Now, granted, they have wonderful medical universities with very long traditions in terms of the field itself, some going back even to the 1600s. But it's very important when having conversations with your international students about where they wish to practice medicine. Because yes, if they're EU passport holders, the Netherlands could be okay for the preclinical years, but when they enter the clinical years, they need to speak Dutch. The same would apply for going to a German-speaking country. So the Czech Republic, Slovakia, I think Malta as well have options for medical degree programs that are not financially exhaustive, but the language portion should be addressed.
If in terms of a resource, and I can send it in the chat box, if any of you are familiar with Ben Ambrose's work, Medical Doorway is a great resource. If you could see my whiteboard right in front of me right now, actually, I was just having this conversation with a student right before this webinar. So I'll share that link so that everyone has access to that resource as well.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for that. I'm going to advance again here. We're coming up actually beyond the hour already. So before we let everybody go, we want to remind everybody that on October 27th at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time, there will be a membership meeting. It's an important one. There will be voting at this particular session, and we invite everybody to attend that program. And I would like to thank all the panelists for taking the time and sharing amazing resources. Safe to say those resources will continue to live on at the website, and all the great resources that not only you spoke here, but also so graciously included in your presentation as well. Thank you for everybody who attended the session, and thank you very much. And we'll see you on the membership meeting on October 27th. Thank you very much.